Hey everyone, we're going to get started now. So thank you so much for coming to our webinar. This is a joint production from Anthropology and Infogee. Today we're going to be talking about the literary genre of Romantasy, which is the mixing between romance and fantasy novels. So we're going to be talking about trends, specifically what the genre is, how it developed so explosively, and what it means for like the greater media landscape. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll get to them as they come in. And also we'll have a time at the end for question and answer period. So let's first walk you through our agenda so you know what you're signing up for. We'll briefly go through introductions about Anthropology and Infogee. We'll then let Chris take it away and give a really good deep dive on the domain of Romantasy and what that actually looks like from a content perspective. Then I'll take over on part 4, and I'm going to look at it from a data-backed perspective. So I'm a researcher, and we're going to be looking at trend identification and how you could have predicted the sort of explosive growth in the genre. And then we'll finally leave time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions, definitely drop them in the chat, and we will happily get to them. Due to the nature of the topic, I'm going to try my best not to blush, but if my face turns red, please forgive me. So, all right, so let's get started. So we'll start with introduction on Infogee's point of view. So Infogee is a social listening and data analytics company. We've been around since 2007, and we build software that really helps identify consumer insights. We do a bunch of work in the entertainment space in Hollywood, and we do a lot of work around like trend identification, so trying to figure out which content pieces are spiking before they do. We're a data science company, so at our core, our insights come from social data. We've been collecting data since 2007. We collect multi-platform data, and what really sets us apart is we collect at the account level. This means that we can get a really good understanding at audience analysis. And this is something we're going to talk about when we start diving into the underlying data behind Romantasy. So we're going to actually look at like who is driving that conversation and what those types of people find interesting. We have a really fast and scalable API if you're work on big data science teams. And we also offer a lot of custom data collection. So this is what we're going to be talking about a lot in this presentation, right? Half of what we're talking about is going to be social data, so like a general perspective of what people are saying on social media. And then we're going to be taking a really targeted look using GoodReads reviews to talk about like what readers actually think about different Romantasy books. So I'll let Chris introduce Anthropology.
Yeah, so we are an audience insights and strategy agency. We work with pretty much all the major studios, streamers. We work with production companies, technology companies. And our work is generally a North Star for people, whether they're working in marketing or branding or developing a new IP entirely. And we've worked on some of the biggest properties that are in entertainment. Which you can see here. And we do stuff that ranges from, here's the landscape of everything that is happening in a genre or about your title. We do genre deep dives in general, where if you just want to know what is happening in action thrillers right now and how should we understand them in order to make them hit more strongly. We have done a deep dive into how do universes work. And in fact, we've got a new version coming out later this year. And we are, definitely the people to call if you need to put together a marketing strategy or figure out what your tactics are. We really run the gamut of being able to put that together for people.
I just finished Skeleton Crew last night. I loved it. I thought it was so cool. So yeah, this slide is wild. I think I've seen all of these movies and shows. So cool. Like Chris and I could nerd out about movies all the time.
Oh yeah.
Let's quickly introduce who your guides on this adventure into the genre are going to be. I'm Henry. I'm a research and solutions engineer at Infogee. I've been at Infogee 3 years. My job at Infogee is complex data storytelling using pretty complex data analytics, but distilling that into a story that lay folks can understand. So I love my job. I joke I have the best job at InfoG because I'm a data storyteller. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm a partner at Fanthropology, and we've been in business for 10 years, and I have 20 years, actually over 20 years now, of experience in entertainment overall. My specialty has always been audiences and fans and figuring out how to connect to them, whether that's through marketing or whether that's optimizing a project while it's still in development. And in the next several years, you'll probably see more of the projects that we can't talk about right now because they are in development. But we've really managed to have some great impact there as well. Yeah, go on. You can go.
Very, very cool. So Chris is going to take this first part kind of explaining the domain and the genre of romantasy. We think this will be really helpful to give everyone a perspective of what we're talking about before we get into the more granular data stuff that I'm going to be talking about in the second half.
Okay, so this first part, I'm kicking off an anthropological look at romantasy. What's the phenomenon? What's happening on a human and a storytelling level? So romantasy, not only huge, but growing fast. So fast. Here, you can see some of the headlines here, but think about it from this perspective. Romantasy was a 454 million business in 2023. It's was 610 million in 2024. That's a huge jump, and it is just still growing. Rebecca Yarros just sold 2.7 million copies of Onyx Storm, which was the third book in the Fourth Wing series. And that was just in her first week of release with that. Now, she's not up to J.K. Rowling numbers yet, but it's only a matter of time looking at the rate that it's growing. And this is a series, The Fourth Wing, that only launched in 2023. So to see that kind of growth is incredible.
I saw the New York Times called it one of the fastest selling books of all time, like in the last decade or something crazy. It was, yeah, it's wild how fast.
I'm referencing J.K. Rowling because she is one of the only relevant data points. That's how fast it sold.
Yeah, it's crazy. Oh, and then this slide is crazy too.
Oh, yeah. If you look at the top 10 best-selling books of all of 2024, half of them are romantasy. And fantasy sales are up, romance sales are up, even print book sales are up, and that's all driven by how popular romantasy is. We're seeing people who were casual readers now become avid readers, and part of that is because when you get into reading romantasy, people are just voracious readers. They finish a series, they're looking for the next one, and the impact of that on romantasy has been tremendous. It's why it has grown as kind of a body of work so quickly. Okay, so now to be specific about what romantasy is, it's primarily a romance, but it's set in a fantasy world. It is not a fantasy with a romance in it. The appeal is really the romance. That's the core of the story. What happens, though, is that when it's set in this fantasy world with tremendous world building, it ends up with a better, more unique plot. It has, I think, a little bit more weight and excitement and appeal beyond women. It is just the crossover in this specific way is really what's driving that adoption. There just hasn't been, especially in the way it's marketed, because there's always been kind of fantasy romances in general, but the idea of romantasy is that you're signing on for the romance and everything else is a bonus. And you also see it leaning into some of these romance tropes that have gotten more popular over the years. So enemies to lovers, you're thinking Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy there, only a little bit more intense. People are already searching if they're a romance reader in general for books that specifically fall into that trope. So it's an easy crossover to pull people into the romantasy area in general.
What is a grumpy sunshine?
That is one of my favorite tropes. It's very fun. That is when you have one character that is sort of dark and gruff and a little emo, and then you have another character that is their exact opposite, perky and happy and optimistic and bright colored. And the contrast of these characters coming together romantically is something that Romantasy readers just really love.
Oh, it's like Han Solo and Luke Skywalker type deal.
Well, not quite. I mean, think it's like if Han Solo crossed with Tinkerbell.
Oh, okay, got it. So more extreme then, makes sense.
Oh yeah. So Romantasy is dominating bookshelves, and you can walk into a Target or a Walmart in their book section. You are just going to find dozens of them. They are all over. And this is driving huge attention towards books that a few years ago might have been considered kind of mid-level, and it's turning them into bestsellers. And the books that were bestsellers, juggernauts. Uh, the readership is just looking for new romantasies over and over again. Influencers are finding this one of the best genres to showcase because so many people are interested in it. And the kind of consistent taste that has developed where people are like, this is what I want, a romance set in a fantasy world, and I'm looking for my next one. It's what's turned it into its own genre, not just it's a romance and it's a fantasy kind of crossed over. It's its own thing. And people are specifically looking for this now. So where did it come from? What really happened, and I find this fascinating, it was incubated by fan fiction. So your Harry Potter fans, your Twilight fans, even your Star Wars fans, they didn't go anywhere after the last big movie. They kept they kept engaging with that kind of fandom, but they were reading fan fiction about those characters, and some of it got a little sexy, got into the romance of it, the relationshipping. Um, and some of this fan fiction then started to go legit and hit bestseller lists on its own. So the love hypothesis there, not a romantasy, but based on a Kylo Ren and Rey fan fiction story that eventually they call it filing off the serial numbers. They take out anything specific to the IP and release it as its own book. The Hurricane Wars, City of Ashes, that's a little bit older, but still all in this tradition of fan fiction that's turned into its own thing. And people get excited about it because it feeds into these character relationships and the type of dynamics that they're already interested in.
Once you told me about the Kylo Ren Rey bit, you can't unsee it after you look at the cover. Like,
Yeah.
it's so obvious. It's funny. Piling off the serial number I find to be a hilarious term.
Yeah, honestly, you could make a million of romances that are exactly like how people like to imagine Kylo Ren and Rey had a romance, and that would not be enough to meet the demand. So the other thing that we're seeing right now that's fascinating is there's this real embrace of guilty pleasures. People are just like, it's a pleasure. I don't need to feel ashamed about it. If you're a woman and you're reading sexy romance books, you don't need to feel bad about it. You can just read them and enjoy them. And what's interesting is that we're also now seeing men join in on this trend. So first, women have been introducing their husbands and boyfriends to their favorite romantasy books, and the guys have gotten really into them. They're enjoying them. These are books that even though they may have a female main character, they also have really well developed heroic male characters to latch onto as well. And then we're also seeing, lastly, the YA readers that were male, the ones that liked Harry Potter or the Hunger Games or something like that. They didn't necessarily key into those because they were female books, but now that we're looking at this romantasy, they're looking at it and saying, why not? It's got all the things I like. It's very similar to the YA. And you know what? I could enjoy a little spice too. we're also seeing the concept of the female gaze, which 20 years ago was just kind of like, well, what do women want to see? We know what the male gaze is. There has been really in culture on TikTok, we're seeing women develop the idea of this, and they've sort of created a general sense of what it is. And so a lot of it comes from women trying to explain over and over again to men, like, it's not the muscles that I'm into. I might like Loki more than Thor. And in fact, many women really genuinely prefer Loki to Thor because he's got that vulnerability, because he is so smart and interesting. A little bit of the bad boy, sure. But there's a lot going on there, and that's what women are latching onto. The other thing that's really fascinating about it has both the romance and the fantasy tradition to pull from. We're seeing a lot of different stories, not the same story over and over again. You've got fairies, you've got dragons, you've got magic schools, vampires, gods and goddesses that all show up. There is some real variety in the types of stories that, especially if you look at Romantasy, what are the top ones? They're very different. This is not cookie cutter. It is not stamp them out, but it is get inspired by a lot of things that existed before and write a Romantasy into that type of idea.
Yeah, getting into this, the depth and breadth of the subgenres was really surprising and really cool. Like Romantasy in general is super, super broad, and there are just so many different directions that authors take with it. And if you're a reader, there's so many different directions that you can go once you've read those like tentpole pieces.
Oh yeah, it's just it there's a lot to explore. It doesn't just end once you've read the top couple books.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which,
Yeah,
speaking of the top couple
you're talking
books,
about.
the big gateways into Romantasy fandom are these incredible bestseller books. A Court of Thorns and Roses, which was originally marketed as YA back in 2012 when the first book came out. But it's really become a cornerstone of the Romantasy genre. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, but it has a tremendous following. And it is not just a very small fandom. This is very mainstream. Sarah's sold 40 million books since she started releasing these, and it is tremendous. And she's still got more to release. And then the other really massive one is Fourth Wing. It launched only in 2023. And right now, if you look at the bestseller list, Onyx Storm is number one on the New York Times bestseller list, followed by Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, the second book, at number two and number three. The level of intensity of interest has been huge.
What what's interesting about that pattern, and this is something that we look at when we look at, researching sequels or trailers into sequels, where often with movies we've seen from a social perspective, the initial movie gets a lot of traction and then the sequel falls off or can fall off. That doesn't seem to be the pattern here though. Like the sequel is attracting tension or attracting attention to the earlier books in the series, which is super interesting.
Yeah, this is really something that is just building and building and building. And not just these series, but a lot of other series as well. These might be the ones people first start off with, but as I already mentioned, they finish these and they're looking for the next one. That's how much they enjoy them. So, a little preview. Hollywood did kind of see this trend coming, but some of its books that it optioned were so early that it didn't quite time it right. And then at the end of the day, none of these have come out yet, although I think there are some right on the edge that are really promising. And so this is kind of an area where we're right on the edge of it. People are thinking about it, people are wondering about it, people are trying to put stuff into development. And it's right on the edge of somebody coming out with one and having the whole idea explode in entertainment.
Can you talk about, because you were explaining this to me a couple days ago, I thought it was super interesting. why why don't any of these have release dates yet?
Well, look, it is complicated to get a film through development into production and have it release. It really, if especially for Romantasy, something that we know has a lot of energy about it, but somebody hasn't released the first one yet. Um, there's kind of not necessarily yet that fire under everybody's feet to get going.
Yeah.
If I were doing it, I would say get going as fast as you can. Um, and these are also the types of books that we work with at Fanthropology, where somebody options them and then we come in and say, okay, let us speed you through all the things you need to know to get development going as fast as you can. And full disclosure, we did work on the Fourth Wing, so I feel really excited about that one, and it's real promising for Amazon. But you got to get those dates out, um, and I think it's going to go fast once people see the first one.
Yeah.
There's gonna be more demand after that. So if you don't have one in development already, you should be looking to get one.
The scenario reminds me of everyone's kind of at the top of a ski hill or a sledding hill and just looking at each other, waiting to see who's going to go first. So
Yeah.
that seems to be the vibe.
And then just for fun, if you like the idea of Romantasy, but you're a little intimidated by all the books that have already been optioned, there are a lot more that are really great. So I put together a list of some of my favorites that I think would be great for adaptation, stuff that has really exciting plots, that can lend themselves to that kind of unique and exciting draw of Romantasy. All right, I'm going to pass it over to you, Henry, for more of a quantified look at what's happening.
Sweet. So what is so cool about what we're talking about is Chris has like real domain expertise. She actually like knows the genre, which unfortunately I don't know the genre as well. What I do know is how to look at and validate trends. So looking at growth data and post volume data from social media and validate whether this trend or this genre, which Chris just talked about for 20 minutes, is having traction from like a database perspective. Now, what's really cool about this presentation that we're about to walk through is it takes kind of like two analytical lenses. First is that general view of romantasy conversation that we tracked across social media, across millions of posts around social media. The second half, though, is a lot more like targeted. And so for that second half, we're looking at custom data collection of GoodReads reviews. So that first portion is really like awareness type conversation. So just general thoughts of what people think about romantasy, and it's helpful for like validating a trend. So it's more of a leading indicator. The GoodReads reviews, on the other hand, are more of like a lagging indicator because people who have left those reviews have read books, right? They're already invested in the genre. They've spent time reading, and so they've left reviews. So taking this kind of dual-hatted analysis will really give us a good idea to all that growth and excitement that Chris was just talking about. So first, let's take a brief look at that social listening based perspective. So this first graph is looking at post volume. So whenever we're trying to validate a trend in the social listening or consumer intelligence business, post volume is our first stop. Post volume is how often people are posting about a particular search topic over time. Now, there are a couple things which are really interesting, which we want to point out about this graph. The first thing is looking at those growth rates. So when we're validating a trend, we want to look at two general indicators. First, the overall picture of volume. How often are people posting about this particular topic? Uh, Although just looking at volume on its own isn't that helpful, right? People talk a lot about cereal, but I wouldn't call cereal like a trending topic, right? So for that other indicator we want to look at is our growth rates. How quickly is this topic growing, or how quickly is it decreasing? So when we're looking at this romantasy type trend, we see pretty traditional like hockey stick type growth up to 2024, and then 2025 we see more growth. What's interesting also about this is we look at just how much attention is paid to tentpole content pieces. So this March 2024 spike is when that Onyx Storm book that Chris was just talking about was announced. And then we see an increased spike again, which actually surpasses that 2024 spike in 2025. Now, the other thing I want to point out about this graph is just how low post volume was in 22 and 23. What that tells me is that this trend or this term wasn't really used in common speaking. Like, no one really referred to the genre, which had existed because a lot of these books are a lot older, as a romantasy book. And so this is another great way of trend identification by looking at like how people are increasingly using terms. All right. So we just talked about post volume. Post volume is really helpful. And I guess there's the saying, no publicity is bad publicity. But in the social listening business, we respectfully disagree. So when you're validating trends and you want to look at trend growth, sentiment is a really important indicator. So sentiment is whether the overlying conversation is more positive, neutral, or negative. With this type of trend, we see incredibly positive sentiment growth. Positivity is upwards at 90 to 95%. But the other indicator I want to look at here too and point out is just how little neutral conversation there is. So if you were to like look at a more neutral topic, like something people don't really have opinions about, again, cereal is a great example, you'll see a higher share of like neutral conversation because people don't really get that invested in how they talk about like specific food. That isn't the case here. Because we see just such a high percentage of positivity and such a low share of negative conversation, it really tells us that this trend has real staying power. Now we can go a step deeper, right? We just looked at post volume to validate the trend, sentiment to check that the overall trend was positive, but we also want to look at emotions. So a good natural language processing algorithm should be able to differentiate unstructured text into more granular emotions like love, joy, or anticipation. And so we see that really similar growth trajectory, right, with a really big spike in January 2025. We ran this all the way to January 2021, so the data cuts off 5 days ago. But what we want to point out here is this increasing share in anticipation. So we see growing share of anticipation, and then a really big picture, a really big share of it in 2025. I've done a lot of research in the past around using anticipation as an indicator for financial performance, specifically in the lens of movie trailers, right? So if a movie trailer drops and you have a really high percentage of anticipation within the conversation, that's a really good indicator that the performance at the box office is going to be good and that the trailer performed well. So we can apply that knowledge, that learning to this conversation here around romantasy, where seeing that leading indicator of anticipation suggests that the growth trajectory is going to continue growing and continue growing on the social space. Now, we can also take a look at channel distribution too. So channel distribution refers to which general sites most of this conversation is coming from. Invigy collects across multiple platforms, big ones being Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, but we also collect from newcomers like Threads or Blue Sky or LinkedIn. Something that was really interesting here is just how much of a visual presence a lot of this romantasy related content has. This was actually surprising to me, frankly, because books are text-based. And I would have expected to see a lot of conversation on text-based platforms like Reddit or Twitter. But we just see a huge amount of conversation from Instagram, right? Like over 50% and around like 40% in 2025. Now, something I also want to point out too is this TikTok share of conversation. So we see lower volume on TikTok, which is expected because creating TikToks is generally much more friction required, like a lot of effort. So we often see lower volume on TikTok. But what's interesting about TikTok related conversation that's not pictured here is just how high engagement rates are and how TikTok related conversation can really push sales. And we'll mention that in the next slide. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we're pointing out top topics. So these are important words which show up frequently within the text. Obviously, you see like read and love show up frequently. We also see some of those series that Chris was talking about it, like A Court of Thorns and Roses, like ACOTAR. And then we also see some of those like more romantic tropes, like enemies or lovers pop up too. Now, on the other hand, though, we see those channels that we were just talking about really driving conversation. So specifically Book Talk and Bookstagram. And if you've been to a bookstore in the last couple of years, they probably have a book talk conversation, a book talk section. And it just goes to show that social media performance and how well books are trending on TikTok specifically can really drive sales. Now, also what's really cool about hashtags is we get a lot more specific view of the underlying conversation, where a lot of those tropes that Chris was just talking about show up even more specifically than on the topics end. Like here we see that trope enemies to lovers show up. We also see books show up, like Fourth Wing. Or you can also see that new adult genre, which Chris was talking about earlier too. So really cool to kind of like validate all of those trends and that really deep subject matter expertise with big data. Now, we also want to look at demographics. So this is something that you can do with a social listing data set, is looking at who's driving the underlying conversation with demographic indicators. Now, we wanted to look at first at age. And what's interesting here is that kind of big share of like quote unquote new adult. So that's like age 20 through 25. I had always thought of like young adult novels as like teenagers, but Chris was telling me a couple weeks ago that it actually ends up trending a lot older than you would think. And new adult would be trending even older, but a lot of these folks are young. We also can look at gender-based growth rates. And this is something I reran because I actually got different results the first time, but I double checked it and I thought it was really interesting that male growth around Romantasy is actually 2x the growth rate of female growth. Now, I want to caveat that. The majority of readers are still female. It's like 90%. But kind of validating what Chris was saying earlier about men being more interested in the genre, that's definitely really reflected in those big growth rates that we've looked at. So really interesting to see just how fast male share of readership is going. And finally, on that social perspective that we're talking about here, as we can do an audience analysis. So this is looking at indicators around like who generally these types of people are from a text-based, like human readable perspective. And we see some that make sense, like that dark romance enthusiast. So these are folks who repeatedly talk online about being interested in dark romance. We also see that indie book advocate, and this is a lot of what I was just talking about relating to TikTok, and a lot of what Chris was talking about too. This kind of emerged from sort of like the fan fiction community. So a lot of these books, at least initially, didn't get published via the traditional lane of like, you get a book agent and a publisher. And so it's really interesting seeing a lot of the conversation drivers being those like indie book advocates versus those more traditional publishers. And the last thing here is that genre crossing reader. So what this is looking at is what Chris was talking about earlier around how broad Romantasy can be, and specifically like how you can have dragons or fairies or vampires all within one genre. Super interesting. All right, so that was that first half of what I wanted to talk about. That was that broad social media listening lens. The second half of what I wanted to talk about is a really targeted approach. So what we did here was we went and gathered around 2 million GoodReads reviews across 150 books around the Romantasy genre. And we're looking specifically around trend-based data around those reviews. And we're also looking at like qualitative indicators of what readers said about the genre. I'll talk really briefly about our data set. When we collect data, we look at review details like stars, likes, and comments, but we also look at reviewer info, so who's leaving reviews and how often they leave reviews. And we also look at like pricing and other types of book information too. So we'll first take a look at post volume. Now, this is what we looked at before. And this growth really mirrors that social growth that we saw before. This is that traditional hockey stick exponential growth pattern. We started collecting reviews from 2017. We go all the way to 2025, and we see just a huge portion of that growth happening within the last year and a half. What's interesting about this, though, is this is actually a lagging indicator. So if we were to overlay this growth chart with the social media growth that we looked at before, we see social grows earlier. And this is really common indicator, right? When people talk about things on social media, it's very reactive and it's very quick to post. So we look at social data like a leading indicator versus actually leaving a review or a rating or a critical review takes some time. And so that tends to lag that social data that we looked at before. We also can look at reviews by author, and this echoes a lot of what Chris was saying too. So we see big authors in the business like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros take up a pretty big share of the underlying reviews, right? Over 50% of the reviews in January 2024. But we look at the other category, which is still really healthy. We also see that Onyx Storm bump, which we talked about earlier, that is what that growth share represents too. But I also want to stress specifically the kind of tentpole way that Romantasy readers get into the genre. We have data that backs this up where they'll start off with a really popular book like A Court of Thorns and Roses or Fourth Wing. And as they continue reading, they'll read less and less popular books. And so what that tells us is you have these entry points into the franchise where people kind of get their bearings and see that they like it. And then they'll kind of go in their own direction, right? They'll choose their own adventure. Specifically, like maybe they like the fantasy aspects from A Court of Thorns and Roses, so they'll go pursue more books like that. Or maybe they like some of the dragon aspects of another book, so they'll go pursue that. And so what's really cool is seeing just how many books people read in the genre. This isn't like other genres, right? Like people read a ton of these books. They kind of consume these voraciously. And so you can draw really interesting lanes down as people experience the genre. Now, when we're looking at review data, we want to look at it linguistically, right? Like those trend-based indicators are really important and interesting, but on the underlying level, we want to see what people are actually like saying about these books. Now, I want to caveat these word clouds, right? Sometimes if you use word clouds, they can be misleading because it's showing two identical sizes, both positive and negative. People really love these books. Ratings are like upwards of 4.5 or 4.8 stars out of 5. So way more positive reviews than negative reviews. So I want to caveat that to make sure we're not doing anything misleading. But you see like what people really enjoyed about the book, right? Like they love the ending, they love the plot, they love the characters, talking about like waiting for the next book. I learned what this was, which Chris already knew what this was. DNF is did not finish. So this makes sense that it shows up on the negative end. They weren't into it, so they didn't finish the book.
I'm
But on
going
the
to jump in and add that this is
yeah,
part of the not feeling shame.
yeah,
If you did not like a book, you do not feel obligated to finish it in the Romantasy community. You're just like, that one didn't work for me, next. And you move on to the next Romantasy book. And that is why that term is so common specifically for them.
I I should learn that. I've definitely felt like stigma about a book I feel like I should have read, and then I just couldn't do it, and then I kind of like slink off dejectedly because I didn't finish it. So I need
There's
to,
just so many good books in the genre that if you hit one that you don't like, you just move
yeah,
on.
yeah, it's super cool. Yeah, it's interesting, like putting like a positive spin on that because I look at that as like a negative term of like, oh yeah, I didn't finish it, it was terrible, but yeah, that's interesting from like a greater, like a broader perspective. It's actually like a positive indicator around the strength of the genre. Okay, so we just took a really broad look at Romantasy, right? Now what we want to do is go into three different series. We picked the two most popular ones, Court of Thorns and Roses, and then Fourth Wing. And then we also looked at the Scholomance trilogy. What we're looking at here is Infigy's narratives feature. What we're doing is we're taking linguistic similarities across different reviews. Each one of these dots represents a different review that we looked at, and we're drawing similarities across them. And what's really cool is when we look at those, 2.7 million reviews that we looked at throughout the course of this analysis, they just naturally group by genre or by series or by book title. So it's a really interesting way of like overlaying what all of the underlying reviews look like, but then also drawing connections to them and showing that like multi-genre connections is like a good way of like bringing readers to the next book they might enjoy. So with our AI feature, what you can do is use our generative AI backed by all of those analytics that we looked at before to kind of pull out those key narratives within the text and get a better idea of what those readers were talking about and how common this thought was. So this is a narrative that we pulled out from A Court of Thorns and Roses. You can see that roughly 14% of the reviews had a narrative like this, which was emotional reader response. So this is talking about like how these books resonated on an emotional level with all of these readers. You can see that we pulled 16,000 reviews or book reviews to make up this narrative. And yeah, we pull it. I have no words for this book, absolutely none. It was a cinematic masterpiece. That ties in nicely with what Chris was talking about around movie, auctioning the movie. So yeah, interesting way that you can kind of like track on a broad level of what readers thought about a book. Within Fourth Wing, we pull out a narrative specifically around genre comparisons. So this is a lot of what we were just talking about before too. Similar indicators around like references to major fantasy books and young adult franchises. So we see readers referring to other well-known books that maybe got them interested in fantasy, like Harry Potter or Game of Thrones. And we also see like, yeah, how expectations are often subverted. I also want to point out this too. This review is actually in Spanish, so it's not pictured in the presentation for brevity, but we found a pretty high concentration of Spanish-related reviews, which I was really interested in because when, I guess as an American, I'm very biased to the US. I think everything is like focused on like English-speaking stuff, and based on our analysis here, that was not true. We saw really big distribution of Spanish-speaking folks leaving reviews. So super interesting. And finally, we wanted to look at this last trilogy. We picked this one because it's a lot smaller. We wanted to kind of show you how granular you can get, and by analyzing not only those big tentpole book pieces, like A Court of Thorns and Roses, but also smaller trilogies like how do you pronounce this? The Showmans?
It's the Scholomance.
Scholomance. Yeah, there you go. There's a C in it. And so this is talking about, yeah, just like really satisfactory endings and trilogy conclusions. So identifying specifically what readers liked about the book. Nice. So it is 12:45. Let's leave it open for questions now. We just talked a lot about the genre and a lot of database stuff. So we would love to hear if anyone has any questions. And I will, let me stop this share. So perfect. Okay. See, okay, looks like we do have some questions. We have a question from Dwight. What is an untapped Romantasy property that has theatrical movie viability? Oh, and it looks like you answered that. Okay, great. Looks like we have another question. Is this graph showing all reviews on GoodReads, meaning Sarah J. Maas has a significant portion of total reviews on the platform? So no, we were looking at just Romantasy specific reviews in that graph. I do want to caveat that with these books are really, really popular, like hundreds of thousands and millions of reviews. So although we were just looking at Romantasy in that graph, she still represents a very large proportion of book reader reviews on GoodReads when you would look at it from a non-genre based perspective. It just would be less, but it wouldn't be like that much less. Let me look. Perfect. Okay, looks like we have a question on how do you ingest a non-traditional data set like GoodReads reviews? Is there a way to export data directly from GoodReads? This is a great question. I got to be careful with this one because I can talk about this type of thing for hours and hours and hours because I'm a huge nerd burger about this stuff. But basically, at a high level, Infigi builds collectors, which scour the internet and can collect specific data from websites that you're interested in. And then we use what's called an API to push that data to our servers so you can analyze it at a high level, like what we were doing there. So we can collect really specific types of data that you're interested in. We only collect public data. So that means you have to be able to access it without logging in to a site. If you have to log in, we count that as non-public data. But yeah, so that's a super high level of how we collect non-traditional data sources like those custom data set GoodReads reviews. Okay, this is a question for Chris. What's the primary difference between romantasy and fantasy with romance? And is that distinction just the gender of the audience? Good question. I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, well, it's not just the gender of the audience. Women, in fact, have been very drawn to fantasy with romance as well over the years. It's just that as romantasy, it really exploded. And part of that was this new focus on the female main character. Fantasy with romance, might have a female main character or a male main character, but also the romance is secondary to this idea. It's not as well developed as the romance is in a romantasy. And sometimes the plot can really move away from the romance. The character, their love interest is not as well developed. If you think back, they're all the way back in fantasy. Female characters just tended to be less developed, less plentiful than male characters in general. We've seen that shift over the years, but with romantasy, you're really seeing, in many cases, a very even gender split with the characters, and they're all really developed. And it's just fascinating watching this happen because it is so driven by the female gaze, where they are looking and seeing everybody in the room and wanting to dig into all of their emotions and motivations.
I'm thinking like The Witcher would be a fantasy book that has romance in it,
Exactly.
but it's not a romance book. So I
No.
guess like the spectrum, you would have romance on one end, fantasy on the other hand, fantasy with romance, romantasy, and then pure romance. Right?
Yeah.
It's like kind of a spectrum. Okay, super cool. Interesting. All right, next question is, did you pull from any other review resources besides GoodReads, like StoryGraph or Reddit? So we looked at Reddit data in the first half of the conversation. Reddit is one of those platforms that we collect from by default. I'm a Reddit evangelist at Infogee. I love Reddit data, partly because we view Reddit as pretty unfriendly to promotional content. So as a result, it's a lot of just regular people talking about what they like. And there are all sorts of really interesting romantasy related subreddits. So we looked at all of those throughout that the course of our research. Reddit data actually ended up being a pretty sizable share of the underlying conversation, which I thought was pretty interesting because when you look at, we've done a lot of work around like platform-based demographics. Reddit is very male and tech leaning. So I was pretty surprised because romantasy is very female leaning. So I guess that kind of shows the danger of taking kind of just general averages of a platform because these platforms are so big. So even if it is more male leaning on average, you still get very strong female leaning communities. Very cool. Looks like, oh, another question for Chris. Can
Oh,
these
can they be made for a price? What do I
yes.
see as the typical budget? There's a huge range in terms of the budget. Things like Fourth Wing with a lot of dragons, that's going to be much higher. But there are projects that could be 5 million, 25 million, much more reasonable, especially at the start of a series. They tend to get more complicated later on. But there's a real range in terms of what can be made realistically, especially with how AI is doing in terms of enhancing settings and that sort of a thing.
It looks like Chris also talked about this one too. You talked a lot about like brick and mortar stores. I didn't look at that much from a social perspective, but you looked at it from sort of like a qualitative perspective.
Barnes and Noble expanding. This is genuinely being driven in part by the romantasy trend. They are just you have to think not only are they buying more books, but they are buying print books. And some of them are buying multiple copies of the same book because the print book is this kind of a trophy. And there's so many different versions with beautiful different kinds of art. The edges of the book and how they're painted or decorated is often a thing. Different editions, international editions. These fans are very strong in their interest. And even though a lot of them are reading via ebook, a lot are also reading the print books. So they really are driving that brick and mortar trend, walk back into the bookstore. There were 1,100 midnight release parties for Onyx Storm, where people were in their bookstores waiting for the book to be released, celebrating how excited they were. I tried to get into the one at the Grove, sold out immediately. Being in person for this audience is huge, which is another factor that plays into the idea of these being great theatrical events, great events for a streaming show where people really want to get together, talk about it, celebrate it in a way that we don't see with most properties.
Yeah, the community aspect of it is really cool. It really reminds me of that Harry Potter launch that we were talking about, like 2007 when Deathly Hallows came out. I remember the pictures from bookstores. It seems like a similar vibe, which we had not.
That's what they know. These
Yeah,
are already people who know how to fan.
yeah,
And they're
right.
going to do their thing again with something that they're this excited about.
But this, I wish I would have looked at this from a social perspective too, because that's something that we could have tracked around looking at like brick and mortar discussions around Romantasy. So this is definitely something we will take a look at from a social perspective. Super cool. All right, do we have any other questions? All right, I don't see any. Oh, no, we do have another one. Do you see any development or trend regarding the female gaze or intimacy in romantasy books? How important is that part to readers, or how much sex do they expect? Do you know how much they expect in the movie adaptations? So I can take
Oh
the first half
boy.
of this, and yeah, Chris can take the second half. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
So we saw pretty good growth rates specifically around people mentioning specific tropes like the female gaze within the underlying trends. So when we see like post volume go up the way it was increasing, a lot of that underlying growth in post volume was made up by those sort of like sub genre based trends, the female gaze being one of them. Talking about the sex question, we saw more overt discussions around sex and sex-related topics in GoodReads reviews versus general social conversation. General social conversation still had that more adult-related conversation, but it wasn't as much as a GoodReads reviews had. I would say, without being too blunt, that it is a very important component of the genre. And I will leave it to Chris around how much readers would expect to see that type of content in a movie adaptation.
I think they'd expect to see the level that is in the book. That's not something you're cutting out. And it's very interesting because this is hugely a Gen Z audience in many ways. And Gen Z has notoriously said things like, we're not, why are you putting these sex scenes in? We're not interested in them. And this kind of shows us when we looked at it in detail, it's not that they don't like sex scenes. They, like every generation, they're totally up for sex scenes. It's the type of sex scene that is the issue. So they are looking for stuff that is sex scenes that have that element of romance, that have real connection, that have the female gaze. Sexy sex scenes is what they're looking for. They're not interested where the sex is meaningless, where it's pathetic or sad, which there's too many movies like that, where it's irrelevant, where you don't really need to know. There's no emotional transport that you're getting from it. So yeah, the sex is really part of the appeal. They're not looking for it in books where it doesn't exist, because not every book in Romantasy is that spicy. Some of them are, however, and when it's spicy, they want the spice. It doesn't need to be the whole thing, but you need to have it in there in the mix in a pretty decent way. Yet they really feel strongly about it. It would be disappointing. Oh, what I said about the sex scenes in Gen Z. So there has been a lot of reporting around Gen Z and how they're not interested in sex scenes. A lot of pushback on this. Um, and it really genuinely is because it's the type of sex scene. Um, it is sex scenes that are meaningless, are irrelevant, that lack real connection between people, that are pathetic or sad. I've seen people sometimes justify this, writers mostly, where they say, well, reveal something about the character. Gen Z is not interested in what a sad sex scene reveals about the character. But if it is a very sexy sex scene, a sex scene that they're feeling viscerally, can I make Henry blush? That they're interested in seeing in theaters, on shows. They are very interested in it. And when we go deep, we find them, if they like a sex scene, they are making GIFs, they are talking about it, they are recounting it. So there's the idea that they don't like sex scenes is a little bit overblown. They like them in a certain way.
Does that make it harder or easier to get it developed as a movie? Or it just depends?
That I couldn't say, you know?